Good evening, everybody. My name is Doug Mitchell, and I have the great privilege of serving as the executive director of the Glacier National Park Conservancy, the park's official philanthropic partner. And it's such a treat to be with you here in January of 2023 as we kick off a new year of the Glacier Book Club. Thank you all for all the support that you've given us. You know, we started this endeavor during our lockdown phase of the pandemic back in 2020. And at that time, I really didn't have the idea that it would catch on so well and get the attention of so many glacier lovers around the country and around the world, and that authors like Doug Chadwick, who's with us tonight, would grace us with their presence and their time. It's incredibly valuable to be able to share this time with you and to have someone like Doug come and talk to us about his amazing book. So Doug, thank you for coming tonight.
Sure. Thanks for saying being gracious enough to come when you actually just dragged me out of a bar somewhere down in Columbia Falls. And
well, we
wasn't doing anything.
We do have a few of those there, but you know, I couldn't even get him to have a piece of pizza before this. So you know, Doug, it's we talked about Wolverine Way a couple of years ago, and this book has come out since then. Talk to us a little bit tonight about your path to 4/5 of Grizzly and your work with Patagonia.
Sure. First of all, you know, I need to say my own hello and my own thanks to people who love books and keep people like me employed and busy and hopeful. So thank you. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I cut my teeth on mountain goats in the Swan Mountains and then in Glacier National Park. And I had to go to Glacier to find an undisturbed and healthy, full population of mountain goats. They were disappearing from much of the Rockies in both Canada and the US. So anyway, Glacier as a laboratory has always meant a great deal to me. And then over time, I focused on grizzly bears, worked with some of the bear biologists. I volunteered in Glacier Park again for, oh my gosh, seven years off and on, in between reporting for National Geographic and other things as on a Wolverine study. And it was a groundbreaking bit of work, and mostly because no one had been paying attention to Wolverines. And again, Glacier offered the single largest, most intact population left in the lower 48. And as we found out, that consisted of only 3 to 4 dozen animals. That's all that could fit in, because they have enormous territories that they defend, and you simply can't crowd them into you know, any one space in considerable numbers. So what led me to write 4/5 of Grizzly? I need to go back to studying mountain goats for a minute. While I was doing that and trying to figure out why they were faring so poorly, I watched new logging roads go into the backcountry up to the edge of the park, up to the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And they were hunting mountain goats unlimited, assuming they were something like deer and elk. They're a whole different kind of creature. Their closest relative is the muskox in North America. And I realized the public didn't know very much at all about this. Well, scientists didn't know much about this animal, and the public knew very little. And they also didn't understand the management of non-protected areas that these species depended on. And I got angry and I said, what can I do? Well, I'm not inclined to go out and carry picket signs. I did go to meetings and yell at people a few times, but so what I can do as a scientist is carry this information out to the public. And later on, I ended up working for National Geographic and doing the same thing all over the world with particular species that needed attention and help, and particular wild places or wild communities of animals that needed help. And you may have noticed I'm getting a little older, And it finally occurred to me that with the huge numbers of species in peril right now, and estimates that we'll lose 1 million species on this planet before the end of the century, you don't have to be a brilliant scientist to, say what we're doing needs to be vastly improved. And then personally, I don't have enough time left to go take on one species or one special place and put a couple of 3 years into it and then go choose another one. And I need to take on how we think about nature, how we think about ourselves, and see if there's a way to change the way we go about conservation. And the animals that will survive in the decades to come, we can study their habitat, we can get all kinds of data. We already have that for a number of species, and it gets ignored. But the real issue is they will survive according not to their habitat so much, not to other biological factors, but according to what we think of them and how we value them in relation to ourselves. And so I wrote 4/5 of Grizzly and came at that subject every way I could.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, that to take kind of a more holistic approach, right, rather than a species by species approach. And I think that comes through very clearly in the book, that we have to think of ourselves as 4/5 of Grizzly, if you will, right? So it's really about the connectivity of all of us and how we can think about wild spaces, think about wild critters, and think about ourselves as one large community. Is that kind of the message of 4/5 of Grizzly?
Well, it's a good way to put it. Look, connectivity works at a lot of levels, and the answer to human happiness is connections to other people. But it's also, it turns out, connections with nature. It influences our health, it influences our gut microbiome. It influences us at levels that change our immunity, our heart rate, our blood pressure, all kinds of things that this is coming out in scientific studies, that contact with nature is one of the healthiest improvements you can make in your life, just like contacts with good friends and other people. So yeah, connectivity means a lot. So that's a big, broad generalization. So now what do we do in conservation to change that? And that's what I periodically drop in with Doug and talk about, what does Glacier Park need in the way of connections? Because it's surrounded by a lot of public lands, but with different management and private lands. And it's not that big a place if you're a grizzly bear, a wolverine, a wolf, an elk,
Right,
etc.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that, because one of the things we've talked about is to focus a little bit tonight on what things are working, right? What's happening out there in the world. And you do that in the book a lot. What things are working. And we're interested in that as a conservancy, of course, because the partnership we have with the park is based upon our being able to support projects like bear studies, like wolverine studies, like connectivity issues that otherwise wouldn't happen without private philanthropy. So I know we want to dig into that. I know Doug really wants this to be a collaborative discussion. So feel free to get in the chat, or if you just want to unmute yourself or raise your hand and ask a question. Doug also has questions. I'll warn you, Doug has questions for you. So so be on the lookout for that. But I want to, as we please do use the chat and or raise your hand and ask any question you might have, and Amy's going to help us curate those. But I want to dig in a little bit to, you talked about studies of wolverines and the space they need, and grizzly bears and the space they need. I know there's a section in the book about wildlife crossings and about some of those things that other places have put into place, say Canada, where there is this connectivity. Talk to us a little about that and how that might translate to glacier country.
Okay, well, with Glacier Park, works. There are bears there because it was what we, in our 100-and-some-year-old model of conservation, we were looking for: a reserve, a preserve. We find a wonderful part of nature, and believe me, I live where I do so I can be next to Glacier. In fact, I lived in a log cabin right across the river from it for 12 years. And I'm in Whitefish now, but as a biologist, I was following animals with radio collars. And let's take a grizzly bear. It's kind of my totem animal. It's in Glacier Park. We call it a park bear. It may den way up right on the Continental Divide because they need a lot of snow cover for insulation, and it's guaranteed to stay through the winter, at least at the highest altitudes. But come spring, it's down in the national forest. It's down on the Blackfoot Reservation. It's up in Waterton Lakes National Park, Glacier's sister, or it's out on the prairie edge, where there's been some protection by land trusts of the ranch lands out there. And then it may drop over to the west side of the divide, head into a whole different national forest. Anyway, there are bears that follow that move hundreds and hundreds of miles, and they do it regularly. They also do it when they're dispersing to new areas. Young males are like young males of our species. They just take off and do crazy stuff. But it's not a park bear. It's an ecosystem bear. They are not park wolverines. They're ecosystem wolverines. Mountain goats are moving across US Highway 2. They need to get across that safely, and there has been a wildlife crossing made there. And then they have to swim the Middle Fork River, but then they're down into the Bob Marshall, Lincoln Scapegoat, Great Bear Wilderness Complex. And that's one reason we have these vigorous populations in Glacier Park, is because we've still got healthy, connected populations, you know, in the whole region. And over time, let's go back to wolverines. I'm sorry if I get too detailed. This is the science part of it, but there are, let's say, 5 wolverines in Glacier Park tops. And we surveyed all over the place. Spent winters in there, skiing around, tracking, collaring, putting out the posts that will gather fur. We can sample their DNA. So in the best, most crowded wolverine habitat in the lower 48, we've got 3 dozen animals, let's say. Of those, half will be female. Of those, many will be immature. That leaves us not very many breeding females. And as they give birth to young, they don't do it until they're 3 or 4 years old, first time. They only do it every other year unless they're on particularly good, rich food or abundant food. And on average, half of their offspring will die the first year. So not many are making it through. So if you, what's called, there's the numerical population, 35, then there's the effective population, which is the number of breeding females that produce young successfully. It's a handful. So that's it in the stronghold for wolverines, is probably 4 or 5 females.
And geographic and genetic diversity is a cure to that, or is the
exactly 5 breeding females is the recipe for inbreeding. And also for adapting, we all talk, I'm sure you guys have talked before about climate change, the impacts in Glacier Park. Another reason Glacier is so valuable is it's a wonderful laboratory for the study of that. But things are changing all the time, and they always have in nature. And the animals need to be able to move, exchange genes with other populations, adapt to changing conditions in their habitat, get replenished from elsewhere if they happen to get subject to a disease outbreak or severe flooding or wildfire or all the other things we call catastrophes, but are routine over time in nature. So as a biologist, especially with large animals and large carnivores in particular, you can't tuck them in any one reserve and say we have saved them. You have maybe for a generation or two, but over time, that's so the old model of scattered reserves here and there is, thank goodness, our enlightened and foresighted conservationists before us set aside these areas. But now that we've got this wonderful string of beautiful natural areas, from Jasper National Park to Banff to Waterton Glacier, on down through the various wildernesses, they have to be one connected ecoregion to hold up truly over time. Then I can see you all again one day, we can pat ourselves in the back and say, now we've saved nature for future generations, like we always talk about.
Well, it's an interesting discussion too about the kind of borders and lines and things, and it's almost about the more we learn, the more we know what we've forgotten or what we've broken, right? That, you know, we created Glacier National Park in the Bob Marshall Wilderness with some lines in legislation and some lines on a map. And for 10,000 years, indigenous people have been treating the landscape as a whole, right? And with projects like the ANIA initiative to try and return bison to the landscape, I think we're starting to get the message that the fences don't matter, the lines don't matter. It's relationships and it's thinking about the larger landscape conservation. I know that's what you kind of want to focus on, and 4/5 Grizzly focuses on is what's working. And so it feels to me like, pardon me, the ANIA initiative, the reintroduction of bison, holds a lot of promise to me in terms of that. And I don't know if you've looked at that project at all, but
I have, and I'm actually on the board of a foundation that supports it, the Liz
Thank you.
Art Ortenberg Foundation. I've also looked at the reestablishment of bison in the Fort Belknap Reservation and on the on the Peck
Fort Peck, yeah.
In Canada, they have put bison into Banff National Park. Glacier Park personnel have said they would welcome them if they come from the reservation into the park. They're historically native to the area. But this is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a several 100-mile continuous, that the bison is a landscape level animal that, like the bear, like the wolverine, leads us to think beyond the boundaries we've considered before.
And we've had some success. I know you and I both, we've talked about Diane, our mutual friend Diane Boyd, who, you know, is the Jane Goodall of wolves here in Montana. We've had her on a Glacier Conversations, been fortunate enough. And, you know, there's been some success on the wolf front, both in Glacier specifically and in Montana generally in our lifetime.
And when the wolves came back, I was living in my cabin next to Glacier.
In Polbridge?
Near Polbridge.
Yep.
And I tracked with Diane the first wolf that came in, and she was a female that was on her own for, I think, almost 3 seasons. Then finally a male showed up. He was missing some toes. He'd made it past some traps. And then we had the first pack formation in Glacier Park, first in 50 years, right? And, you know, as wolves became part of the ecosystem, then I'll bet a lot of you have heard about what happens when they put wolves back. They reintroduce them, whereas the ones in Glacier came naturally. But in Yellowstone, when wolves came back in, the coyote population dropped by half. The fox population went up as a result. The elk stopped being able to camp in riparian areas and browse down all the red osier dogwood and aspen and young cottonwood. And you have this lush regrowth of vegetation. Beavers showed up after they ran out of food, so they've been extirpated there. And beavers came in And then you had wetlands, nesting birds, more fish, more insects, I mean, just a richer ecosystem. Well, in Glacier Park, you can see when the wolves came in the regrowth of aspen and cottonwood.
And the wolves, meaning that had been an extermination project
Yeah,
by the United States government, not in secret.
in parks
right?
as well as out.
Engineering Eden, which is a terrific book. He also, Jordan Fisher Smith has been a guest of ours as well. The idea that you can break up this cycle somehow, right? That keystone species can be separated from each other just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. And the other thing I noticed is a change in vegetation, but the cougars that had been down in the valley bottoms more, and they were the kind of the top pure predator there. Suddenly, they weren't necessarily fewer, but they were moving back up into the more rugged, broken country where they excel, and there were more carcasses around left by the wolves that grizzly bears were scavenging, and a couple of male grizzlies were staying out all winter long. They had enough food. They don't need to protect their young in a nice snug den.
Right.
They need to get bigger so the next mating season in May and June, they can the dating scene will be much to the liking. But anyway, the ecosystem changed. And I think about how all these animals are shaped by their competitors, by their predators, by every other animal in the system at some level. And that's saving nature, saving single species here or there and counting them within a limited area is not saving nature.
Right, it's got to be a holistic approach.
And so that leads me to think of how much of my own instincts, impulses, nerves, glands, muscles, reflexes have been shaped by 8 million years of hominid evolution in wild settings. And since human relatives separated from the chimps and gorillas, 99.999% of our existence has been in the wild. We wouldn't have called it wild because there was nothing else but wild. But we were shaped by all these creatures. And I say 4/5 a grizzly because I share at least 80% of my genes with those bears, with those wolves, with red pandas, with chipmunks, with mice, and so do all of you. And so there's other ways to look at connections. And I won't dive into too much of the geek science, but I'm very taken by the fact that I have 30 trillion human cells, but I have more microbial cells in my body, in my gut, in my mouth, on my skin, everywhere. And I have 22,000 human genes. I have about at least 8 million microbial genes in my body, and they're all doing stuff. They are coding for different chemical processes, and our microbiome is having a huge effect on us that science is just starting to delve into, but on our health and happiness, our moods, and possibly our thoughts, because some of these bacteria and yeast and single-celled protists are producing hormones that are almost identical to the ones that influence our mood and thoughts. And so this balance, we're more than what we think we are. Or put the other way, we're way less separate and special than we think we are. I call it our greater selves are more than human. And that fascinates me because it means we are a compound creature and we're part of nature and nature is part of us, whether you like it or not, or you believe that we're super special or not.
Right. I kind of was taken, and I want to get to Amy because I'm sure we've got some great questions in the chat, and I know Doug has some questions. But as I think about this, I think about I was challenged to think about I belong, right? So when I go outside, I know that it feels good to me. I don't know why. But when I think about 4/5 of my genes being the same as animals in the wild, I can say to myself, I belong. But there's a responsibility to that, right?
Yes.
When you belong to a community, you have a responsibility to that community. And I think as civilized people, I think that's a little bit scary.
Well, if these estimates of losses, and certainly everywhere I've worked in the world, I see it, and of other species disappearing before my eyes. And you can look at the cold statistics and you go, boy, that's too bad, or that's pretty dramatic. It doesn't hit you here, but necessarily in terms of numbers, but you think that's part of my greater self out there disappearing. The last vaquita porpoises down in the Gulf of Mexico, the last tool using orangutans, the Javan rhinoceros. I mean, on and on.
And I know that's kind of one of the questions that we talked about that you were interested to know from the group is, what are, as a member of that community, what are you doing? What are we prepared to do to help out?
But
So
before we get lost in global doom and gloom, I mean,
right.
I think it's a really positive thing
For sure
that we are more than human and we are related to these animals. It doesn't make us any less. It makes us way, way, way more. But again, this is kind of abstract thinking. I live where I do because I can go to Glacier Park in a big hurry, and I can be in a place surrounded by goats and sheep in view, maybe a bear or two, elk, moose. The world the way it was. And when I watch their behavior, I see some of myself in them and them in myself. I see a grizzly bear mother sliding down a snowbank with her kids on her belly. That's what I do. And I just have to do solo.
Yeah.
And I see a sense of play. I see excitement. I see when there's a pending electrical storm, everybody's charged up and doing crazy stuff, and goats are spinning wheelies on the snow. And belonging, that word you used, I just feel I belong.
Yeah.
This is a wild place. And I think that's why time spent in nature, even if it's just a city park or a green space or your garden, that's why it has this huge impact on the human sympathetic or parasympathetic system, which is basically your blood pressure, your heartbeat, your natural immunity strength. All this gets boosted, and they can't pin down exactly how and why in each case, but you can get health coverage from your health insurer for going outdoors in nature in Japan and Korea.
Yep.
And last year in Canada, I noticed that the National Park Service gave free passes to doctors up there, and they gave them to patients that they thought that's the best health thing I can prescribe.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there you go.
That's super
Another way to
interesting.
look at the value of the park.
All right. So Amy, I can see in the chat that there have been some additions over time. What do you got for us?
Yeah, there's a lot in the chat, and I'm going to encourage some folks to maybe unmute and ask their questions. But I'll start off with a Candy and Carl question, and they say that they've been hearing that grizzly bears are getting the bird flu. What is the impact to the species in Glacier, if any?
Over to you, boss.
That's a great question. I do not know the answer. And since he doesn't, I'll call.
They have found it. All I know is they have found it in some other mammals too, including some more common ones. I don't know if it was ground squirrels or it was something not nearly as dramatic as a grizzly and more familiar and more widespread. So I think everyone's asking that same question, but if I could answer it, I guess I'd be back at the National Institute of Health right now.
Well, I'll call Waller and see what he
Yeah.
knows. Yeah, I'll call John Waller and see what he knows. We'll get back to you, Carl and Candy. Good question.
More to come on that one. I was hoping that maybe Margaret Notley would raise her hand. Margaret, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, so not bird flu, but COVID, and it's just another reminder of our interconnectivity, right? You know, diseases jumping and incubating and crossing species barrier back and forth. And so when I think about the grizzlies and the bird flu, I'm just put in mind of that too. But I just, while I'm talking, I put it in the chat, but I wanted to just thank you, Doug, just an incredible reminder of the interconnectivity. I've spent a lot of time in England. I used to live down the road from Kelmscott, where William Morris was sitting in his 3-seater outhouse and saw the thrush in the garden eating the strawberries. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the arts and crafts movement. I separated in my psyche, right? That's an intellectual pursuit, artistic pursuit. But right here, I flip open, the first page I get to is the strawberry thief pattern. And it hit home for me. And it really connected me to what you're talking about. So thank you. That's
wonderful to hear. And can I answer, or not an answer, because it was for a statement on viruses, but yes, indeed, a reminder that we can't be separate from nature, even if we try. 2 reasons. Right now, if I were to stay right here in this square yard for 24 hours, 800 million would rain down onto me from the air. Secondly, about 8% of the human genome is of viral origin, which means it doesn't mean that it's been a human infection. It could have been in one of our ancestral fish. But in the vertebrates over time, what we used to call junk DNA turns out to be viral segments, many of which have been repurposed, some of which have been found recently to be possibly a key in long-term memory formation in humans. Another is known to be a key in the attachment of the fertilized egg to the human placenta. So we're all here. This is not a great time in the world to be going out and saying, aren't viruses great? But they're just viruses doing what they do. And they have the same genetic material they're working with. And they get involved with ours, and we're 8% viral. We're 24% a wine grape and 4/5 a grizzly bear. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, science is a challenge.
Yeah.
and it's really interesting to think about, again, all that interconnectivity. So good comment and question. What else you got, Amy?
Well, sticking with the I guess the interconnectivity a little bit, I was wondering if Doug Bonham wanted to unmute perhaps and ask his question. There's a third Doug on, if you guys can believe it.
Yes, I hope three Dougs is a winning poker hand. But Doug, I got to tell you, I was just a few years behind you with Dr. Wright in Missoula. And when I told him I was starting to work in the park, you said, Doug, you do you know Doug Chadwick? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, you need to look up Doug Chadwick when you're up there. And after reading your book, I realized I should have taken his advice. I should have chased you down back there in the 1970s. But my question is, I kind of duplicated your goat counts this summer, the counts you did at the Salt Lick. And there's barely a third the goats there now that from your 1970s counts. Do you have a theory?
No, I think you had someone here speaking on, did you on goats?
On goats, yep.
And were they talking about, you could sum it up, but I had heard that figure, and I heard it from Jamie Belt working with.
I gave her my numbers. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was shocked because the Glacier Park goat herd was the only one in the state native herd, rather than some transplanted to some kind of wild places. Wild meaning not very natural, but anyway, Glacier had the only native goat herd that was staying the same or increasing. Every other native goat herd in Montana had been declining. And so when I heard that Glacier's counts are way down, I don't know, but what did your
Yeah, I don't remember, and I think it was Mark Beal who we had, who kind of has been leading up that research, but we're actually going to have Jamie with us here on a Glacier Conversation. Amy, do you know the date of that off the top of your head? I know it's within the next couple of weeks, right?
I think it's
So
February 8th.
Jamie Bell will be with us. I'm sorry, I talked over you.
No worries. I think it's February 8th.
Yeah, so Jamie's going to be with us. That's a great topic to follow up on. We've been funding goat research through Mark and his team for, and thanks to all of you, for quite a while, because it is again, it's an indicator species, right, of ecosystem health, and so it's really critical to this work.
Great.
And
Great.
Amy, you're also we've got a couple of prizes that we're going to give away tonight. We're going to give away a Glacier calendar for those who do not already have one, and also a Glacier pennant. So I know you're going to do a little selection later on as we move forward. And what other questions do you have out there?
can I make a quick comment?
Yeah.
I just want to thank Doug for following up on well, and Jamie and the whole crew, but following up on the goats. I hope you had a great time covering those trails and getting to know those animals. I sure did.
I'll try to post a link to my chart. My chart's superimposed right on top of your chart from 1975. I'll try to post a link to it in the chat.
That'd be awesome, Doug. Thanks a bunch. I like all this thanking of Doug. It's really making me feel really good.
Yeah, Doug, and I hope that you join us for Jamie Belt. It would be great to have you on February 8th, and maybe you could share some more of your research.
Of course, thanks. I'll be there.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to jump back into questions because, wow, we sure do have a lot, and we'll fit in the giveaway here. So Marilyn wanted to know, her parents met in Glacier in the 40s while they were both working at Many Glacier, and she remembers stories her mother telling her that grizzlies were never an issue when they were there, and she sort of assumed that they had been eliminated and wanted to know when they were reintroduced. So I was wondering if we could do a little history on the grizzlies in Glacier.
Wow. I never heard of them being eliminated. They were very close to it in a number of areas. Yellowstone is a good example of, they now estimate they have 750, 800 grizzlies. In late 1970s, they had probably closer to 200, 250. And they figured 23 or 24 breeding females left. And Glacier Park may have been at a much lower point. But I've never heard of that. No, that was the stronghold. And again, they were there. There's connectivity with wild areas to the north in Canada. I'm going to talk connectivity again. Wolverines were extirpated from all of Montana. And the fisher, a relative in the weasel family. They're beautiful. I wish we had them. They were there. They have not come back, but wolverines came down from Banff through Waterton and into Glacier in the probably starting late 60s or 70s, and increased and since dispersed to parts of central Idaho, all the way down into the Yellowstone ecosystem. And some recently have come from Canada into North Cascades National Park, which again gave them an area to recharge, and they've since dispersed. Some have shown up in Mount Rainier National Park. So they know where they're safe, I guess, but Anyway,
And also where there's that, again, this connectivity piece of where there are food sources, right? One of the studies that, again, all of your generosity helped us fund was what we call the bear butter study on Army cutworm moths, right? And they are present in the park, and because they're present in abundance, grizzly bears can find nourishment in the park and they can reproduce in the park. And so that, you know, the holistic ecosystem approach is, again, talking about successes, that has been a success story.
yeah,
As we have put ecosystems back together and let them do their thing, let science do its thing, that has worked.
yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, they serve the function of a refuge and a preserve, and still do. And I just, you know, keep coming back to the idea that over the long term, nature goes through too many changes. It's not static, whereas the reserve borders are. And they're not big enough. And I'm saying this based on, I worked with elephants, snow leopards, jaguars. I mean, I make that sound more important than what I did. I tagged along with researchers working with all those animals for years, and it's the same story everywhere. They're confined sometimes to small reserves. They suffer a lot of mortality when they leave them. They need to be connected to a larger system if they're going to survive. And so this is not anything unique to our area. Can I ask a question?
Please.
Audience, through our great and far-sighted moderator. Because this is something that's puzzled me for the longest time. I'm completely mystified. Why, for example, you've probably talked about micromanaging increasing numbers of visitors in Glacier Park and rearranging hours and public transportation and permit systems and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's great to see this focus in some ways, but why is the American government continuing to starve national parks? You guys have been, I understand, important supporters and valuable supporters and care deeply. Why are we underfunding our national parks at a time when they're being used by dramatically increasing numbers of people? Why are we not talking about making more national parks? I assume you guys are probably wondering the same thing, and I wonder if anybody.
Well, I'll give you some context to that, so I'm going to give you guys a preview of what our finance committee is going to learn tomorrow, which is that for the first time ever, the Glacier Conservancy, because of your generous support, is going to be able to fund $3 million worth of projects in Glacier National Park this year. I mean, it's an incredible accomplishment, none of which happens without private philanthropy. But to Doug's point, so to give you a context to that, the entire operating budget for Glacier National Park for this year is $15.1 million. So private philanthropy is going to give 20%, increase the park's operating budget by 20%, right? And that's a huge lift for all of us, right? I mean, look at the 85 plus tiles on the screen, right? And think about $3 million. But when you think about the federal government and $3 million, this is not a good head cold. So I think that also answers that other question. What are you willing to do about it, right? Are we willing to sit down with our senators, one of whom chairs the National Park Subcommittee, and have this discussion, right? Glacier's budget 20 years ago was $13.1 million. We've gone from 1 million visitors to 3 million visitors, right? The math doesn't work here. So I think there's risk. Again, this is the risk of belonging, right? Is that if we don't do something, the Conservancy and Conservancy donors can't be the park, right? If these are national parks, then we have to kick in for them.
Yeah, and the reason I'm mystified, well, I asked the question, I'll shut up in just a minute so someone can answer, but it isn't just that you love national parks, I love my national parks. I think it's the greatest democratizing influence we have, that I own, well, public lands, but parks in particular, near and dear. And yet we're irresponsible owners of them. And I don't just see the grandeur and the wildlife. I see, again, this contact with nature. I see the healthiest thing anybody can do for themselves is go for a walk outdoors. The exercise brings a lot of identical benefits to just contact with nature,
Yep.
which you can have sitting on a stump. But this will be the best thing in the world for the health and happiness of the American public, in addition to, the inspiration and the experience and the drama of a majesty of the parks. Why aren't we making more progress? Why do we have to go in and beg and plead?
Why aren't we investing in America's best idea?
There you go.
All right. Well, and if anybody wants to jump into that discussion, feel free. Amy, you probably have a couple of other questions as well.
Yeah, more than a couple, but does
We've
anyone
got
want
about
to jump
15
in?
minutes, so we want to, judge our time, but.
All right, I'm going to move on, but if anybody wants to jump in or raise their hand at any point, feel free. So Eric and Tanya asked one, and this is one that's sort of a, what can we do? They wrote, the commercial value of wild animal parts continues to be a threat to animals worldwide, which you did address in your book. What are the strategies for addressing and changing this?
Great question.
Can you phrase that again for me?
Yeah, so the price of wild animal parts is causing degradation.
Okay.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that can be addressed?
Again, what the Claiborne Foundation funds checks of black markets and gray markets and wet markets, as they call them, which since COVID they're not only destroying wildlife, but they're incubating new strain or passing new strains of virus on to the people. But it's awful. I mean, China, of course, is a leading consumer of all kinds of animal parts worldwide. And when you go to China, they have thousands and thousands of customs officers and wildlife officers and all kinds of people employed in these bureaucracies, and none of them ever manages to do anything, because apparently the powers that be are somebody's making money, or they're just too comfortable with it, or it would shake things up a little too much. It's a old socially accepted system. The thing that has made some changes is some of the personalities, actors, basketball stars or two, let's just say actors, athletes, and other well-known people have spoken out about the illegal wildlife trade and the use of animals in so-called traditional medicine and aphrodisiacs and so on. There are some great groups in England and elsewhere in Europe working on the ground to try to stop it, but it's going to take social changes. It's going to have to be not cool. And I was doing a story for Geographic on elephants in the late 80s when I was walking from one elephant carcass to another with its tusks cut off. And all this was going to trinkets and to what they call hankos, which are little ivory stamps with a carving on the end that you put your seal on a letter with. And that was the high status thing. And so
Interesting.
these 12-ton wonderful, intelligent giants with a brain 3 times the size of ours were being reduced to these little trinkets, and it looked like the end for them. So I'm going to try to get Andrew a picture up here.
Amy, while we're doing that, do you have our contest winners?
I sure do.
Okay, I'm going to try to get this. Are we on?
I have to take the mouse away or the power away from you so I can put that.
Oh, that's where it went.
Yes.
Okay.
Who you got, Amy?
So our lucky winners are Shelley McCoy, and I believe Shelley's going to win a calendar, or one of our new 2023 photo contest winner calendars. And then
Awesome.
Kathy Mendy is going to get our pennant. And we will
And
be in
Wendy.
touch, Shelley and Kathy, and get your information, put this stuff in the mail for you. Congratulations.
Is everybody able to see the elephant picture?
Yep.
Okay, this is one version of the elephant, and here's a happier one. This one was rescued from poaching, and this is in a water park somewhere.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
To lose something like that, it'd be like losing the grizzly bear here. Is just, you know,
Yeah.
a level of nature, of intelligence, of social interaction, of inspiration that I
And what a tough challenge, right? I think of, although it may be an odd comparison, but I think of kind of the war on drugs, right? There's there's a supply issue and a demand issue, and it's hard to attack either side, but
And here's the irony is we're I'm talking specifically about elephants now, but they were going to Japan when Japan had all the money in the world, and now China has all the money in the world. That's where elephant ivory has been going. And there are some parts used for medicine and so on, but the medical fact that it really intrigues me is that elephants have how many trillion cells, all these tissues, this ginormous land mammal, and they don't get cancer. What do we have to learn from elephants?
right.
And and whales apparently the same. There's something in the coding that is working for them. And with all the genetic analysis we're doing, we may be able to draw from that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so it's a lot more to losing a species than just saying, oh, it's too bad, it was really beautiful.
And it's good facts that we have a lot of the same DNA.
Well, that's why it would work. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So Doug, pardon me, Doug has also been kind enough, if you'd like a book plate signed by Doug Chadwick to put in the book, he would be happy to do that for you. Thank you very much for doing that. And so just email grace@glacier.org, or you can use the chat also to do that. Now, it wouldn't be a book club unless, of course, we have had our speed round. So I've warned Doug in advance that he needs to, this is going to be a tough, that's right. You better, that is water, just FYI. Okay, so here we go. You ready? Okay, so a nice crisp IPA or a hearty stout?
Hardy stout.
Hearty stout, very good.
In winter.
Correct answer. Designated hitter rule or no?
Designated,
Hitter in Major League Baseball. We've established you're a baseball fan.
yeah.
Are we okay with the designated hitter or no?
Yes.
Oh, wrong answer, but okay, I'll accept it.
Okay, we'll talk.
Okay,
later.
okay, well, this is the, cross-country skiing or downhill skiing?
You like watching pitchers strike out kind of. How could I be wrong?
Bob Gibson could hit. Okay, Bob Gibson could hit. I'm just saying.
Okay,
Okay, cross-country skiing or downhill skiing? Focus.
cross country.
Cross country, easy, okay. Stegner
More
or
Abbey.
Abbey?
More Abbey.
Stegner or Abbey?
Abbey, I know.
Abbey.
I knew Abbey,
New Ed Abbey. How about that, ladies and gentlemen? New Edward Abbey. That is something.
not well. but
Okay,
good time.
last but not least, east side of the park, west side of the park.
Oh,
I know. It's like, who's your favorite kid? I mean, you have one.
can you guys see our wildlife?
We have box elder bugs. We got a hatch of box elder bugs.
I'm not, Senator, I refuse to take a stand on that. I plead the fifth. I do not recall.
At least you didn't say Senator McCarthy. I'm going to take that as a win. Okay, well, thank you for playing our game. Amy, I think we got time for a couple more last questions.
Okay, I will do my best. There was one person on an iPhone that had their hand raised, but then that went away. So just want to make sure I didn't miss. Okay.
Nora, did I see you have it? Randy, did I see you had your hand raised? Randy Gray, he will always be my mayor of Great Falls.
Hi,
There you
Doug.
go.
Hi,
Hey, Randy.
Doug Squared. So this is just a comment, maybe an answer to Doug's question to you, and I guess my question to you, Doug Mitchell, is our science, Doug, has been very gracious in coming and very gracious in writing this book, and proving the case of connectivity is just essential. The 70, now 46 people on this, 75 people participating in this call, I don't think there's one of us that wouldn't agree 100%, 110% with the importance of connectivity. But I'm putting on my political hat, which is the Doug Mitchell side of things, and I look at our state legislature right now, and I look at our, at least House of Representatives in Washington, and there is just a large majority of those members of those bodies that can't wait to cut any connectivity that there might be on anything. And so I think one of the answers to this is that rather than having 74 folks involved in these kinds of conversations, we need to be multiplying ourselves to 740 million folks to be lobbying the real people to make the decisions on these things. So how we boost ourselves from 73 to 700 or 700 or 73 million is the question, but I think that's our challenge.
Well said.
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's right. And I used to, my dear friend and former employer, Senator Max Baucus, used to say that you got two choices in life. You can try or do nothing. Right. And so you just have to try. I do think, and I think Randy's right, but all politics is also local. And when you talk to, and I was just in Helena and I was testifying on a grant that we got to restore the Burton K. Wheeler cabin, former United States Senator Burton K. Wheeler in the park. All of the Flathead members are all for it, right? Because the politics is local in that case. So I think, yes, we have to make a national statement about connectivity and belonging and those kinds of things. But the best way to do that is by building that relationship locally, because people in this area, albeit mostly a Republican legislative assembly, care deeply about the park. Right. And so if you can make that connection, I think that's how you do it. And we just have to try. Write that letter to the editor, stop your senator when you see him in the airport, and those kinds of things. So
connectivity again. I know it's discouraging when you're having a nice discussion and the reality of politics and especially current political situation comes in, but every poll shows an overwhelming majority of Montanans like and use and respect their public lands and are grateful for their public lands, from parks to other managed areas. And everybody likes to be healthy. And everybody, I've talked about the benefits of nature that are physiological as well as mental. the feeling of belonging is a lot of intangible things, but I think conservation sometimes tends to feed into that polarization where we're blaming people, we're trying to make people feel guilty, we're trying to be more moral than thou. And I think we need to get over that and talk about the positive aspects for us. It isn't just save the purple tongue bull, it's save ourselves.
Mhm.
And in you know, a world where we are changing the skies, the temperatures, the seas, the quality of our air, water, and land. This is doing it for us.
Yeah.
And we need to make that connection that this is for everybody. And again, why not just focus on one single species? Do you like wolves or do you hate them? We can spend months arguing that, and you're not going to change some people's minds. But Montanans love their outdoors, and we all benefit from having these places. Plus, we underplay the economic issue. I don't know about with Glacier Park, which is the economic engine of where I live. Where
The
we
goose
live.
that laid the golden egg.
Yeah, but it's also outdoor recreation and tourism is the leading source of revenue for the state of Montana. We got barely 1 million people. We got what, 12, 13 million coming through and leaving behind that nice green stuff that Democrats and Republicans all like.
Last number I saw was $3.1 billion in out-of-state tourism in a year.
So why are we environmentally inclined people on the defensive on this? I think if you want more jobs, if you want more revenue, you create more attractive lands that the public already owns, but ways for them to use it.
Right,
And
right.
this shouldn't be either or.
No, I think that's exactly right. Well, we're going to run 4 minutes overtime, but Amy, I want to get in one more last question. I know you've got a great one there.
Well, I will say that our iPhone raised hand is back and made a comment that
Great.
you have a question. So if that person wants to unmute,
So I have unmuted if you can hear me.
we sure can.
Yes.
Good. I'm a Floridian, so Disney sort of makes our income in this state. But what I want to say is in the basic level, non-scientific level of all you geniuses that know this kind of information, share it with us. I find there is a severe lack of knowing where our national parks are. We have 3 in Florida, and 95% of my friends who are college educated, who travel the world, do not and cannot name those 3. They can name the Everglades. They can't go beyond that. There's almost like if you want to do grassroots and get support, somehow people have to know where these parks are. We get a little bit of information when there's a new one, but I have been to all the national parks, including all the new ones, and people are just shocked that I even know where they are or what they are. So I'm suggesting beyond the science, beyond the politics, which are extraordinarily important, it's almost like we need a grassroots in each of our states. I think Delaware is the only state that doesn't have some kind of national park. Go to and how to spread the information about what you can find in these parks and what you can do for a day. And you can take kids, you can do a picnic. But that's sort of my speech is we're missing grassroots understanding of our national parks.
Right. And that's the way, if you're going to get support, right, people have to know what they need to support. So that's a great point. So thank you. And Doug Chadwick, thank you. Thank you for what really has been a remarkable career of caring for and caring about this larger ecosystem of our global planet. Because without writers like you, thought leaders like you, we as novices don't really have anything to hang on to. So thank you for giving us that. It's a great gift.
Well, it's either that or getting honest jobs.
Well, there's always that.
Yeah.
And to this group, what a great way to kick off 2023. This is our largest book club event ever. Certainly one of the most fun for me personally. And I thank you all for all the support you've given us. both over the last year and for a long, long time. And just for the personal friendship, this has really been a meaningful time for me, and it's been a great time for me to meet. I did not know Doug Chadwick prior to this. I feel like I too have a new friend, and as I know you do. Doug is officially part of our Glacier family and has been for some time. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of January, and we'll look forward to seeing you in February and beyond. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. That was just wonderful.